Chapter 9 and then have a little review for the examination. And before I start sharing, I got to bring the slides up. We're going to finish the chapter on interest groups. So that should be up now. Let me know if it's not. Interest groups are a linkage group that connect people's interests to the government in specific groups. There are many, many interest groups everywhere. Today we talk about how they function. Conjunction, junction, what's your function? That is an old Saturday morning educational cartoon called Schoolhouse Rock. That's one of the cartoons about conjunctions. So the primary function of interest groups is to lobby. That is to make appeals to try to influence policymakers. We can break lobbying up into two types of lobbying. And this is outlined in your textbook beginning on page 263. Inside lobbying is establishing a direct connection with lawmakers or policymakers. At one time, interest groups depended upon bribes to get their interests protected or to get money from government. And one thing I wanted to mention before I forget is that even though we talk a lot about the corruption in government, and there is definitely corruption in government, and there are politicians that have made a career out of being in government, but for the most part, we can say that the majority of people who entered into politics, they have a desire to help people. And so lobbyists are simply trying to capitalize on the desire of lawmakers to help people. And so the inside lobbying techniques are to basically develop relationships with those people who will help your interests. And it really helps if those politicians and leaders themselves have a strong interest towards that particular issue. But anyway, bribes used to be a major way that interest groups would secure government support. But bribes have since become illegal. So our textbook lines up three main ways that inside lobbying groups try to obtain support support for their interests, to get laws passed for their interests, to get government funds for their interests. Now, the first thing is that they have to have a good command of the information and be able to skillfully use it. In other words, when lobbyists go to Washington, D.C., and many interest groups have they have people, they have offices right inside of Washington, D.C., so they literally are inside. When you go to meet with a senator or a committee, you've got to have all of the proverbial saying, you have to have all your ducks in a row. You have to have all your information. You have to have a good command of it. You have to know what you're talking about. And so that when you share it, you're convincing. It's very convincing to those that are listening. And so that can include giving testimony before the legislation, being able to show a strong command of the information might get you recruited to help in writing a bill. And you might also, which some lobbyists want to do, have direct contact with some of the executive agencies, that is the executive branch. If you can have direct contact with them, you get closer to the president himself, which our textbook points out later that while there are lobbying groups that mainly lobby to each of the three branches of government, those that lobby the executive branch, it's a little bit harder to have direct contact with the president and vice president. So if you know your stuff, you can get more direct contact with executive agencies, therefore increasing your chances to have direct contact with POTUS and the vice president. So you got to know your stuff, got to have a good, strong command of knowledge and the information. Secondly, a key to success for inside lobbying is what's called the revolving door technique. It's on page 262. And this is putting people in your lobbying groups. For example, let's take a farm group. Let's take a cattleman association group. It would help tremendously if you have ranchers, cattlemen ranchers on your lobbying group. And they have large ranches, large cattle operations. They know the inner workings of the cattle industry. And if you ever had a cattleman serve as a senator or a congressman, once they finish their term in Senate, in Congress, it's very good to recruit them into your lobby. This is the revolving door technique. Someone And a lot of times people who get elected into Congress at one time were lobbyists. So there's a revolving door there to go from a lobbyist to a senator, or to go from a senator or congressman to a lobby. And then the third key thing that inside lobbying needs to have is money, money, money. Money is always important. Now remember, they can't bribe, so there are legal ways to financially contribute so that your lobbying efforts are successful. Money is needed to set up the office of a lobbying group within Washington, D.C. Money is needed to pay your staff in Washington, D.C. There are people who make a living as lobbyists. They get paid. And then you have to have money for public relations. At the top of page 163 in the textbook, now this is a 2016 text, so 4 years ago. So it's still probably fairly accurate. There were roughly 12,000 registered lobbyists working in Washington, D.C. Now let's compare that to some other numbers. With senators and representatives, I believe we have 536 members of Congress. We have 9 members on the Supreme Court. And then in the executive office, we have the president and vice president and the president's cabinet, which is probably 30 to 40 people. Now, if we just go with the top leadership in the 3 branches, let's just use 40 for the executive branch, 536 in the legislative branch, that gives us 576 total, and then 9 Supreme Court justices, which would give our total to 585. So let's just round it up to 600. Compare 600 leaders in the 3 branches of government in Washington, D.C. versus 12,000 lobbyists. 600 versus 12,000. Someone make sure my math is correct, but that seems like is that 20 lobbyists per leader in the 3 parties? 20 times 600 is 12,000, is that right? So that shows you how influential inside lobbyists are. Now, obviously, in Washington, D.C., you have executive federal agencies. But surely we can see that lobbyists who live and are registered in Washington, D.C. are a much larger number than elected officials and judicial appointees and agencies that are appointed. Now, the next section talks about how lobbyists lobby the three different branches of government. Congress is the one that is most, let's see, there are more lobbyists trying to influence Congress, the legislative branch, than the executive branch and the judicial branch. You all did an assignment, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you did an assignment on the iron triangles and the issue groups. See if I have that. Yeah. And I'll have these slides posted today too. But remember, the iron triangles are basically a network made up of three groups: bureaucrats, your interest groups, which is the subject of our chapter, and congressional committees or subcommittees. So our textbook used the example of an iron triangle in the realm of agriculture, which is the one used here. Specifically for this example, the tobacco division of the Department of Agriculture. And then you would have interest groups that would lobby for tobacco farmers and manufacturers. And then you have committees and subcommittees of legislators who are appointed to study and make policy on issues concerning tobacco. And so these three groups are a tight-knit group. And they are a group that continues. They don't dissolve. And they basically do things for each other to get policy passed and to get funds for this specific issue. Issue networks are more recent, and you're seeing more of them crop up. Iron triangles aren't as prevalent as they used to be, but since they're kind of permanent, you still have them around. Issue networks are more loosely structured. And again, the issue here is tobacco. But instead of having just these three iron groups, or these three groups that make an iron network or an iron relationship, this network includes not only your congressional committee and your interest groups and your bureaucrats, but you can have opposing interest groups in this issue network. Like you could have an anti-tobacco interest group in here, so that when they talk about tobacco as a whole and its benefit or detriment to society, anti-tobacco groups are going to talk about the dangers of smoking. You can also have other groups come in, like university professors or universities that have a research group studying, like you'll hear about a recent study by the University of so-and-so shows that, sticking with the topic of tobacco, it shows that smoking, that vaping is just as dangerous as smoking. You can have media personalities as a part of this. And so an issue network is more informal, and it is temporary. So you want to know these things because these two things will be on the exam. Iron triangles are more formal with just these three groups, and they're more permanent. Issue networks are more informal. They have more participants, and they are temporary. The iron triangle is more focused on the participants. The issue network is more focused on the issue. This is a more stable grouping. That is more stable, more permanent. Since this is more temporary, this is less stable. All right, very quickly, along with inside lobbying, there is outside lobbying. This is where interest groups will get their people probably need to go up here a little bit. Yeah. Outside lobbying tries to encourage members of interest groups or organizations to write letters to their leaders, to make phone calls, to contribute financially, to vote. And then you will see these two groups on the test. Let me see something here. Called PACs and super PACs. Yeah, I knew I had something on them. Basically, a PAC is a political action committee. So let's take the NRA as an example. The NRA is a very wealthy interest group. Within the NRA, they have a political action committee. And the political action committee of the NRA is designed specifically to collect money and provide financial support for a political candidate. This is an example of different PACs that contributed to Democrats and Republicans in the 2015-2016. I don't see NRA on here, but if you look at this International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, they're very strongly, they're a union, so 98% of their funds went to Democrats. Now, one thing about PACs that you need to know is they can only give $10,000 to a candidate. So let's just go back to the NRA. In the 2016 election, the NRA could only give $10,000 to Donald Trump total. $5,000 could have been given to him when he was running against all the other Republican nominees. the primaries. And then when he got the nomination as the Republican candidate and he ran against Hillary Clinton, the NRA could have given him another $5,000 for the general election for a total of $10,000, but they cannot give more than $10,000. So they could have given $10,000 to Donald Trump. They could have given in the primary runoffs, they could have gave $5,000 to every Republican candidate running for the Republican nomination. $5,000 to Jeb Bush, $5,000 to who's some other Republicans that ran in 2016? Ted Cruz. Now, super PACs are a fairly newer organization, and these are committees that a group like the NRA can have, and they can spend unlimited funds on elections and campaigns, but they cannot use those funds directly with the candidate or with the party. So, for example, the NRA PAC has given $5,000 to Donald Trump, and they gave it to him they gave him $5,000 for the primary and $5,000 for the general, so $10,000 total. It went directly to Trump's campaign. Now, the super PAC in the NRA cannot give money directly to Donald Trump, but they can spend as much money as they want, putting up their own ads on TV, sending out mail in favor of Donald Trump. They just can't coordinate it with Donald Trump's campaign or with the Republican Party. So super PACs have really grown to have great influence in the last few years. And Bernie Sanders, the Democrat from New Hampshire, was strongly against super PACs. So I'll post these slides today that you can use. We're going to stop there and do a little review, but are there any questions about the rest of chapter 9? So the exam will be very similar to Module 1 exam. The nice thing is you have one less chapter to worry about, chapter 6 through 9. So there was a question asked earlier about the realignments of the political parties in chapter 8. That will be on the test. Know what those realignments were, pages 220 through 224. But also I want you to know about some of the new ideologies that came out of these new realignments. In other words, new ideas and new viewpoints that they had. This is all in the text. So if you read that section and highlight it, and you'll be ready for the exam on that part. Also, are there new coalitions that were formed in those realignments? Okay, so let's go back to chapter 6. I just mentioned that because that was asked directly by one of you students earlier. So in chapter 6, the chapter on how people are socialized for voting. You're not going to have to worry about polls and basically the first part of chapter 6, how they measure public opinion. What I want you to be prepared for begins on page 167. How do Americans arrive at their opinions concerning politics? And so this will include the ways that Americans are affected, the agents that socialize us for voting, for politics. Beginning on page 168, the primary agents are family, school, and church. Page 169, the secondary agents are friends and media, leaders and events. I want you to be aware of the frames of reference for how Americans think politically. Remember, that is usually either it's our political party or it's our political ideology, that is liberal versus conservative, liberal economically, conservative economically. This is the section right after how we are influenced to vote. It begins on page 171. And then are we a part of any groups? So that's 171 through 180. Then in chapter 7, I want you to know, and this is more of a history question, but it's in our text, page 191. I think you all need to know that 1920 is when women were granted the right to vote, since this is 100 years since that happened. So read about that on 191 and 192. Know that that is and then know the 3 amendments that we talked about when it comes to the history of voting and how there was like a 50-year gap. Remember around 1870, the amendment that allowed for all people to vote, that is all males. 1920, women were given the vote. And then 1971, with the 26th Amendment, people 18 years and older could vote. So know what those 3 amendments are and why they're important. That's it for chapter 7. I've already told you chapter 8 about party realignments. I also want you to know about the history of political parties in America. So that's the beginning section of chapter 8. Just kind of familiarize yourselves with the little figure 8.1 at the bottom of page 217. I think I also included a chart in the slides. You know, we started out with Federalists and Whigs, and then it went from Federalists and Democratic Republicans, and then the Federalists died out and you had Whigs crop up, And so you had Whigs and Democratic Republicans. And then Democrats dropped the Republican title, and it was Democrats versus Whigs for a while. Then the Whigs died out, and you had a new Republican Party. And that's what we've had ever since, is Democrats and Republicans. So know that history, along with the realignments. And then in chapter 9, know about the iron triangles and the issue networks. Understand what some of the different kinds of issue groups are. Remember, there are economic issue groups, there are labor issue groups, there are citizens issue groups. Know what differences are between PACs and super PACs. So any questions about what's going to be on the exam? All right, so it'll be available tomorrow night by 9 or 10 p.m. You'll have through Tuesday to complete it. In case I forget to put it on the test, please include page numbers. I want your textbook to be I don't want you to Google stuff. I want you to use what's in the textbook. All right, so that'll be available tomorrow night, but we still will have class Monday. So we'll see you then. Have a great weekend if there's no other questions.
I do have one question. Our Wi-Fi was just cutting out right there at the end when you were saying when everything was due. Do you care to repeat that really quick? I'm sorry.
No problem. The test is due Tuesday the 6th at midnight. Your final module project, or your final module assignment, excuse me, your final module 2 assignment is due tonight. If you haven't done all your discussion posts, you still can do that until the 6th with, of course, a late penalty. And you can also do your briefs until the 6th or the assignment that's due tonight. You can always turn your module assignments in till the end of the module just with a late deduction. But anyway, the only thing that's left that's due is the assignment tonight. The test will be available tomorrow night, and you'll have until Tuesday the 6th to do it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay, we'll see y'all next week. Just stay online, Dustin, and we'll talk. Okay, go ahead and type it out.